It was a house that defied explanation, a sprawling structure on the outskirts of a forgotten town. The mansion had long been abandoned, its once grand exterior now cloaked in vines and decay. Locals spoke of it in hushed tones, referring to it only as the Sculpture House. At first, I thought it was a name born of small-town superstition, another urban legend for bored teenagers to embellish. But as I delved deeper into its history, I realized there was something more sinister lurking within its crumbling walls. The story began with the mansion's original owner, an eccentric sculptor named Elias Grayson. A prodigy of his time, Grayson's works were hailed as masterpieces, renowned for their lifelike detail and haunting expressions. He was a recluse, rarely seen outside his estate, yet his fame spread far and wide. In the late 1800s, Grayson abruptly stopped exhibiting his sculptures. Rumors swirled that he had gone mad, obsessed with some dark muse. The mansion fell silent, and soon after, Elias vanished without a trace. All that remained were his sculptures, dozens of them, still eerily intact despite the passage of time. I arrived at the mansion on a cold, overcast afternoon, the kind of weather that seemed tailor-made for ghost stories. My purpose was simple, to investigate the rumors and uncover the truth behind the enigmatic sculptures. The online community of urban explorers had dubbed it the most haunted place you'll never escape, a challenge I couldn't ignore. Armed with a camera, a flashlight, and a notebook, I pushed open the rusted gates and stepped onto the overgrown grounds. The first thing that struck me was the sculptures themselves. They were scattered across the property, standing in silent vigil among the weeds and rubble. Each figure was exquisitely detailed, their faces frozen in expressions of anguish, terror, or despair. One statue depicted a woman shielding her face with her hands, her features contorted as though caught mid-scream. Another showed a man on his knees, arms outstretched in a silent plea for mercy. It was as if each one had been petrified in the throes of some unspeakable torment. Entering the mansion was like stepping into another world. The air was heavy, carrying the scent of mildew and something faintly metallic. The walls were adorned with peeling wallpaper, the floors warped from years of neglect. Despite the disrepair, the sculptures were pristine. They lined the hallways and occupied the rooms, each one seeming to watch me as I moved through the house. I couldn't shake the feeling that their eyes followed me, their gazes filled with a palpable sense of malice. The deeper I ventured, the more unsettling the sculptures became. In the dining room, I found a tableau of a family seated at a long table. The father figure had his head bowed, hands clasped in prayer, while the mother clutched her child tightly to her chest. Their faces were twisted in expressions of dread, as though anticipating some inevitable doom. On the table before them were sculpted plates of food, a roast chicken, vegetables, a loaf of bread, all rendered in flawless detail. It was a scene frozen in time, yet it exuded a sense of foreboding that made my skin crawl. I began documenting everything meticulously, taking photos and jotting down notes. As I examined the sculptures more closely, I noticed something strange. Each figure bore subtle imperfections, minute cracks that seemed to run deeper than the surface. It was as if the sculptures were not carved from stone, but something else entirely. My mind raced with possibilities, each more outlandish than the last. In the mansion's library, I discovered a journal, Elias Grayson's personal writings. The entries were disjointed, descending into madness as they progressed. At first, he wrote about his inspiration, his desire to capture the essence of life in his work. But soon his tone changed. He spoke of a whispering muse, an otherworldly voice that guided his hands. The muse, he claimed, had shown him the secret to creating sculptures that were more than art. They are vessels, he wrote in a trembling hand. Trapped within is their essence, their souls. I felt a chill run down my spine. The implications were horrifying. Could it be that these sculptures were not merely representations of people, but the people themselves? I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was impossible, absurd. And yet, The evidence before me seemed to corroborate Grayson's claims. As night fell, the mansion seemed to come alive. Shadows danced across the walls, and the air grew colder, heavier. My flashlight flickered, its beam casting erratic patterns that only heightened my unease. I found myself drawn to the basement, the only part of the mansion I had yet to explore. The door was locked, but a quick search yielded a rusted key hidden among the debris. The basement was a cavernous space, its walls lined with shelves cluttered with tools and materials. In the center of the room stood a large workbench, covered in dust and remnants of clay. But it was the sculptures that dominated the space. They were different from the others, more grotesque, more monstrous. One figure appeared to be clawing at its own face, its features distorted in a macabre grimace. Another seemed to be writhing in agony, its limbs contorted in unnatural angles. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, a sense of dread that was almost tangible. At the far end of the room I found a large tarp-covered object. My hands trembled as I pulled the tarp away, revealing a sculpture unlike any I had seen before. It was Elias Grayson himself, or at least a depiction of him. He was seated in a throne-like chair, his hands resting on his knees, his face bearing an expression of serene authority. But his eyes, they seemed alive, glinting with an unnatural light. I took a step back, the realization hitting me like a freight train. Elias hadn't vanished. He had become one of his own creations. Panic set in, and I turned to leave, but the sculptures blocked my path. They had moved, rearranged themselves to form an impenetrable wall. Their faces were no longer frozen in anguish. They were smiling, their eyes filled with malice. The sound of stone grinding against stone echoed through the room as they began to advance toward me. Desperate, I searched for a way out, my flashlight beam darting across the room. It landed on the journal, which I had dropped in my haste. The final entry stood out, its words scrawled in a frantic hand: "Destroy the vessel. Release the soul." I turned back to the sculpture of Elias, understanding what I had to do. Grabbing a heavy mallet from the workbench, I swung it with all my strength. The impact sent cracks spider-webbing across the figure's surface. A low, guttural scream filled the room, resonating deep within my chest. The sculptures froze, their malevolent smiles fading. I struck again and again until the statue shattered, releasing a blinding light that engulfed the basement. When I came to, I was outside the mansion, the morning sun breaking through the clouds. The sculptures were gone, the mansion's windows dark and lifeless. It was as if the house had finally exhaled, its cursed occupants set free. I left without looking back, my camera and notes the only evidence of what I had witnessed. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that mansion. The rational part of me wants to dismiss it as a hallucination, the product of an overactive imagination. But the photos and recordings tell a different story, one that chills me to the core. I've shared my findings with only a few, and most dismiss them as fiction. But I know the truth. Elias Grayson's sculptures were more than art. They were prisons, and in freeing them, I may have unleashed something far worse.